My younger brother spread rumors around town that I abuse my children. Neighbors turn away from me. People whisper behind my back at work. And all because I refused to lend him money. I never thought my own family would destroy my life over something so petty. But here I am, 33 years old, sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning wondering how everything fell apart so quickly. 3 weeks ago, I had a normal life in our small Iowa town. I taught at the local elementary school, had friendly relationships with my neighbors, and my 2 kids were thriving in their activities. Now I feel like I'm living in some twisted nightmare where everyone thinks I'm a monster. It started when my brother showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening in early March. He had that desperate look in his eyes that I'd come to recognize over the years. The same expression he wore when he dropped out of college, when he lost his 3rd job in 2 years, when his girlfriend kicked him out last Christmas. He needed money and he needed it bad. This time it was $8,000 to cover some debts he'd racked up, though he was vague about the details. Something about credit cards and a loan from someone who wasn't exactly patient about repayment. I'd helped him before, more times than I care to count. When he was 25 and couldn't make rent, I covered it. When he totaled his car and had no insurance, I helped with the down payment on a replacement. When he had that gambling problem he swore he'd overcome, I paid off what he owed to keep him safe. Each time he promised it would be the last time, and each time I believed him because that's what sisters do, right? We enable the people we love until they drag us down with them. But this time was different. My oldest had just started needing expensive equipment for her activities, and my youngest required some medical attention that insurance only partially covered. My own finances were stretched thin, and I'd finally learned to set boundaries after years of watching my brother make the same mistakes over and over. When I told him I couldn't help this time, that I simply didn't have that kind of money available, he didn't take it well. The conversation got heated quickly. He accused me of being selfish, of caring more about my perfect little life than my own family. He said I'd always looked down on him, always acted like I was better just because I had my act together. The words stung because there was a grain of truth in them. I had been frustrated with his choices, and maybe I hadn't hidden it as well as I thought. But refusing to bankroll his irresponsibility didn't make me the villain he was painting me as. He stormed out that night, slamming my front door so hard it rattled the windows. I figured he'd cool off and we'd work things out eventually like we always did. Our relationship had survived worse fights than this one. I had no idea he was already planning his revenge. The first sign something was wrong came about a week later. I was at the grocery store when Mrs. Peterson from down the street saw me in the produce section. She'd always been friendly before, often stopping to chat about the weather or compliment my garden. This time she gave me the coldest look I'd ever received and turned her cart in the opposite direction. I thought maybe she was having a bad day or hadn't seen me clearly. Then it happened again at the post office. The clerk who usually made small talk about my kids suddenly became very professional, almost hostile. She avoided eye contact and processed my package without a single word beyond what was absolutely necessary. I started to feel paranoid, wondering if I'd done something to offend people without realizing it. The truth hit me like a freight train when I ran into Sarah from my yoga class at the coffee shop. She actually had the decency to approach me, though she looked uncomfortable doing it. She asked if everything was okay at home, if I needed any help or support. When I pressed her about what she meant, she reluctantly explained that people were talking. Someone had been spreading stories about how I treated my children, claiming I was too strict, too harsh, maybe even physically abusive. My blood ran cold as she described the rumors circulating through our tight-knit community. According to the gossip mill, I regularly screamed at my kids, punished them excessively, and had been seen hitting them in public. The stories were detailed enough to sound credible but vague enough that no one could pin down exactly who had witnessed these alleged incidents. Sarah said she didn't believe the rumors herself, but enough people were talking that she felt she had to ask. I knew immediately who was behind it. My brother had weaponized our small-town gossip network against me, knowing exactly how devastating these particular accusations would be. In a community where everyone knows everyone else's business, being labeled as someone who hurts children is social death. It doesn't matter if the claims are true or not. The suspicion alone is enough to destroy relationships and reputations that took years to build. The impact on my daily life was swift and brutal. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches now disappeared inside when they saw me coming. Parents at school pickup started avoiding conversations with me, pulling their children a little closer when I walked by. Even some of my colleagues began treating me differently, though they were more subtle about it. I could feel the weight of their judgment in every interaction, see the questions in their eyes even when they tried to act normal. My own children started noticing the change too. They asked why certain friends weren't allowed to come over anymore, why some parents seemed uncomfortable when I volunteered for school activities. I struggled to explain the situation without frightening them, or making them feel responsible for the adult drama swirling around us. They were innocent victims in my brother's vindictive game, and watching them suffer for his actions made my anger burn even hotter. The worst part was the helplessness. How do you fight whispers and rumors? How do you prove a negative? I couldn't exactly go door to door demanding people confront me with their accusations. I couldn't force anyone to reveal their sources or provide evidence for claims that existed only in hushed conversations and knowing looks. My brother had chosen his weapon carefully. Social isolation and character assassination are nearly impossible to defend against directly. I tried reaching out to him multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading. I wanted to understand why he thought destroying my reputation was an appropriate response to my financial boundaries. I offered to help him find other solutions to his money problems, suggested family members he could approach instead. He never returned my calls or acknowledged my messages. It was like he'd vanished from my life entirely, leaving only the wreckage of his revenge behind. Update 1. 3 weeks have passed since I wrote my original post, and I honestly wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to update you all. The support from strangers on the internet kept me sane during some of my darkest moments, but I wasn't prepared for how much worse things would get before they got better. The situation at work reached a breaking point about 10 days after my first post. I'd been noticing subtle changes in how my administrator and colleagues treated me, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Then I got called into a meeting with the principal and the district supervisor. They sat me down and explained that they'd received several anonymous calls expressing concern about my fitness as an educator. The callers claimed to have witnessed me being inappropriately harsh with my own children and questioned whether someone with anger management issues should be working with kids. I felt like I was drowning as they outlined their concerns. They made it clear that while they hadn't received any formal complaints about my classroom conduct, the community perception was becoming a problem. Parents were asking questions, and the school board was getting nervous about potential liability issues. They placed me on administrative leave pending a full investigation, which is education speak for guilty until proven innocent. Walking out of that school building felt like a death march. I devoted 8 years of my life to that place, had genuine relationships with my students and their families, and now I was being treated like a potential threat to children. The worst part was knowing that my brother's lies had reached the one place I thought I could count on for stability and purpose. Being home during school hours while my kids were in class gave me too much time to think and spiral into darker thoughts. I started questioning everything about myself, wondering if there was some truth to the accusations that I couldn't see. Maybe I had been too strict sometimes. Maybe my parenting wasn't as patient and gentle as I thought. The constant doubt was eating me alive from the inside. My children were struggling too, though they tried to hide it from me. My oldest came home crying one day because a group of kids had cornered her at lunch, asking if it was true that her mom hit her. She defended me fiercely, but I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. No 12-year-old should have to deal with that kind of scrutiny and judgment from their peers. The financial pressure was mounting too. Administrative leave meant reduced pay at a time when I needed every dollar to keep our household running. I started looking into legal options, meeting with an attorney who specialized in defamation cases. She explained that proving damages in a small-town gossip situation would be extremely difficult, especially since we couldn't definitively prove my brother was the source of all the rumors. People talk, stories get embellished, and by the time gossip spreads through multiple people, the original source becomes nearly impossible to trace. I was at my lowest point, seriously considering packing up and moving somewhere fresh where my children and I could start over, when something unexpected happened. My brother's girlfriend reached out to me through social media. She asked if we could meet privately, said she had something important to tell me about what had been happening. We met at a diner 2 towns over, far enough from home that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. She looked terrible, tired, stressed, like she'd been carrying a heavy burden for weeks. She started by apologizing for not coming forward sooner, then told me everything she knew about my brother's campaign against me. Apparently, he'd been systematically calling people in our community, pretending to be a concerned citizen who'd witnessed disturbing behavior. He'd researched our neighbors through social media, learned enough personal details to sound credible when he called them. He told different stories to different people, but always positioned himself as someone who cared about child welfare and was struggling with whether to report what he'd seen. The girlfriend explained that she tried to talk him out of it initially, but he was consumed with anger about my refusal to help him financially. He felt like I'd abandoned him when he needed me most, and he wanted me to experience the same kind of desperation and isolation he was feeling. She said he'd gotten increasingly paranoid and aggressive, convinced that everyone in our family looked down on him, and that I represented everything he couldn't achieve. What she told me next made my blood run cold. My brother hadn't just been spreading rumors randomly, he'd been building toward something bigger. He'd been researching how to make anonymous reports to Child Protective Services, trying to figure out exactly what kind of allegations would trigger an investigation. He was planning to call in a formal complaint that would result in my children being questioned by social workers and possibly removed from my home while the allegations were investigated. The girlfriend said she couldn't stand by and watch him destroy innocent children to get revenge on me. She'd been documenting his behavior, recording phone conversations where he bragged about his plan and admitted to making false reports. She had evidence that could prove my brother was the source of the rumors and that he deliberately fabricated everything out of spite. I felt a mixture of relief and rage that nearly overwhelmed me. Finally, I had proof of what I'd known all along, but I was also horrified by how far my brother had been willing to go. The idea that he'd been prepared to traumatize my children just to hurt me revealed a level of cruelty I never would have believed he possessed. We spent hours going through everything she'd documented. Phone recordings, text messages, even notes he'd written planning his next moves. It was like looking into the mind of someone I no longer recognized as the little brother I'd grown up with. The person revealed in those recordings was calculating, vindictive, and completely indifferent to the collateral damage his actions were causing. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update, and I'm finally in a place where I can share what happened next without breaking down completely. The evidence my brother's ex-girlfriend provided changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Sometimes getting what you want most reveals costs you never anticipated. Armed with proof of my brother's deception, I went straight to the police. They took the recordings and documentation seriously, especially when they realized how close he'd come to filing false reports with Child Protective Services. Making intentionally false allegations of child abuse is a serious crime in our state, and the systematic nature of his campaign made it even worse. The detective assigned to the case was thorough and professional. She interviewed my brother's ex-girlfriend extensively, documented all the evidence, and began reaching out to people in our community who had received the anonymous calls. Several neighbors admitted they'd been contacted by someone claiming to have witnessed concerning behavior, and a few even recognized my brother's voice when pressed about details. Meanwhile, I took the evidence to my attorney and to the school district. The principal looked genuinely shaken when she listened to the recordings of my brother admitting he'd fabricated everything. She apologized repeatedly and assured me that my administrative leave would be lifted immediately, but the damage to my professional reputation was already done. Some parents had already requested their children be moved to different classes, and I could see the doubt lingering in colleagues' eyes even after the truth came out. The hardest part wasn't dealing with the adults who believed the lies. It was helping my children process what their uncle had done to our family. They'd loved him despite his flaws, had looked forward to his visits and holiday appearances. Learning that he deliberately tried to destroy their sense of safety and security in our community was devastating for them in ways I'm still trying to understand. My brother was arrested on charges of criminal harassment and filing false reports. The local newspaper covered the story, which finally gave me a public platform to clear my name, but it also meant everyone in town now knew the intimate details of our family dysfunction. There's something deeply humiliating about having your personal business dissected in print, even when the coverage vindicates you. The court proceedings were emotionally exhausting. My brother hired an attorney who tried to paint him as someone struggling with mental health issues who'd made poor decisions in a moment of crisis. They didn't deny what he'd done, but they argued for leniency based on his emotional state and lack of prior criminal history. I had to testify about our relationship, about the pattern of financial requests and my reasons for finally setting boundaries. Seeing him in court was surreal. He looked smaller somehow, defeated in a way that might have made me feel sorry for him if I hadn't been living with the consequences of his actions for months. He never made eye contact with me during the proceedings, never showed any sign of remorse for what he'd put my children through. His focus seemed entirely on minimizing his own consequences rather than acknowledging the harm he'd caused. He ultimately received a suspended sentence with community service and was ordered to pay restitution for my legal fees and lost wages. The judge made it clear that any violation of the restraining order I'd obtained would result in immediate jail time. It felt like justice, but also like an incredibly hollow victory. No court ruling could undo the months of isolation and suspicion my family had endured. The aftermath in our community was complicated. Some people were genuinely apologetic about how quickly they believed and spread the rumors. They organized a small gathering to show support for my family, brought meals during my transition back to work, and made extra efforts to include my children in activities they'd been excluded from during the worst of it. But others seemed almost resentful that they'd been fooled, as if my brother's deception was somehow my fault for having complicated family relationships. A few neighbors never quite returned to their previous friendliness, maintaining a polite but distant demeanor that suggested they weren't entirely convinced of my innocence despite the evidence. Small towns have long memories, and some people prefer holding on to their suspicions rather than admitting they were wrong. Going back to work was its own challenge. The administration bent over backwards to welcome me back and restore my standing, but the classroom dynamics had shifted in my absence. Some students had heard fragments of adult conversations and looked at me differently. Parents who had once been warm and collaborative were now formally polite. I had to work twice as hard to rebuild relationships that had been damaged through no fault of my own. My children showed remarkable resilience, but I could see the ways the experience had changed them. They were more cautious about trusting adults outside our immediate circle, more aware of how quickly social dynamics could shift against them. They'd learned lessons about family loyalty and betrayal that no child should have to absorb, and I worried about how those lessons might affect their future relationships. Final update. 6 months have passed since this nightmare began, and I'm writing what I hope will be my final update because we're finally moving forward instead of just surviving. The legal proceedings concluded last month, and while my brother will be dealing with the consequences of his actions for years to come, I've reached a point where I can focus on rebuilding, rather than just defending myself. The most significant development came from an unexpected source. The local newspaper editor who had covered my brother's arrest reached out to me about writing a longer feature story on how false accusations spread in small communities and the lasting damage they cause. She'd been researching similar cases and was struck by how common these situations were becoming in the age of social media and instant communication. Working with her on that article was therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. It forced me to really examine what had happened from all angles, to think about the broader implications beyond just my personal experience. We interviewed experts on community psychology, legal professionals who specialized in defamation cases, and other families who'd survived similar ordeals. The article that resulted was picked up by several regional publications, and even caught the attention of a national magazine. The response to that coverage was overwhelming. I received dozens of messages from people who'd faced similar situations, parents falsely accused of abuse, teachers targeted by vindictive families, community members who'd been victims of coordinated harassment campaigns. Their stories helped me understand that what happened to us wasn't unique, that there are predators out there who understand exactly how to weaponize community concern for children against innocent families. More importantly, the coverage led to concrete changes in our community. The school district implemented new policies for handling anonymous accusations against staff members, requiring more evidence before taking disciplinary action. The local police department developed better protocols for investigating harassment campaigns and false reporting. Our experience became a catalyst for systemic improvements that might protect other families in the future. My relationship with my brother is permanently severed, and I've made peace with that reality. His ex-girlfriend told me he'd been badmouthing me to anyone who would listen even after his arrest, claiming I'd somehow orchestrated his downfall and refusing to take responsibility for his actions. Some people are incapable of growth or genuine remorse, and I've learned to accept that my brother falls into that category. The restraining order remains in place, and I've had no direct contact with him since the court proceedings ended. I heard through extended family that he'd moved to another state, probably to escape the social consequences of his actions in our community. Part of me hopes he'll eventually get the help he clearly needs, but a larger part of me is simply grateful that he's no longer able to directly impact our lives. My children have shown incredible strength throughout this process. They've learned to distinguish between the adults who truly care about their well-being and those who are simply curious about drama. They've developed a healthy skepticism about gossip and rumors, understanding that people sometimes say things without knowing the full story. Most importantly, they've seen that truth eventually prevails even when it takes time and effort to emerge. Our community standing has largely been restored, though it took months of consistent, positive interactions to overcome the initial damage. I've been more involved in local activities than ever before, partly to demonstrate our commitment to staying and rebuilding, and partly because I genuinely want to contribute to positive changes. My children are thriving in their activities again, and we've developed some new friendships with families who stood by us during the worst of it. The professional consequences were more complex to navigate. While I was officially cleared and welcomed back to my position, I realized that staying in the same school where the accusations had circulated would always carry some residual awkwardness. When a position opened up at a neighboring district that offered better opportunities for advancement, I decided to make the move. It felt like a fresh start rather than running away from problems. Financially, we're still recovering from the legal expenses and lost wages, but the restitution payments from my brother help offset some of those costs. More importantly, I've learned to build better emergency funds and support networks so that we're less vulnerable to future crises. The experience taught me the value of having resources and relationships that exist independently of any single community or institution. Looking back, I'm struck by how much this experience taught me about human nature, both its worst and best aspects. I learned that some people are quick to believe the worst about others, especially when the accusations involve children and emotions run high. But I also learned that many people genuinely want to do the right thing and will stand up for justice when presented with clear evidence. The most important lesson was about resilience and the power of truth. There were moments when I felt completely defeated, when the weight of false accusations and social isolation seemed unbearable. But we survived, and we're stronger now than we were before this began. My children learned that they can count on me to fight for them no matter what, and I learned that I'm capable of more strength and determination than I ever knew. I won't pretend that everything is perfect now, or that we've completely moved past the trauma of those months. But we're building a new normal that incorporates the lessons we learned without being defined by the pain we endured. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us reveal strengths we didn't know we possessed, and lead us toward better futures than we could have imagined. To anyone facing similar false accusations or family betrayals, I want you to know that it is possible to survive and rebuild. Document everything, seek legal advice early, and don't be afraid to fight for your reputation and your children's well-being. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, but it often requires patience, courage, and the support of people who believe in you, even when the evidence seems stacked against you. Our story doesn't have a fairy tale ending where everyone apologizes and relationships are magically restored. But it has something better: a realistic resolution where justice prevailed, lessons were learned, and a family emerged stronger despite facing deliberate attempts to destroy them. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for, and it's enough to build a good life upon.